We were advancing through an area that had been an intense battlefield just days before. Remnants of weapons, shells, and abandoned trenches adorned the landscape as a grim reminder of death. The sun was setting, and the elongated shadows of the trees whispered stories none of us wanted to hear. On a small elevation of the terrain, something caught my attention. It was an old rifle, different from any other I had seen. Its design was unusual, with strange engravings and an air of antiquity that contrasted with the modernity of our weapons. I felt an irresistible urge to take it. As I did, a sensation of power surged through me. It was as if time had stopped around me, and a voice in my head whispered promises of greatness and victory. What I didn't know was the price we would pay for it. Since I found the rifle, things began to change. My aim inexplicably improved, and every bullet I fired hit its mark with deadly precision. My comrades looked at me with a mix of admiration and fear, but inside me, something darker was beginning to awaken. One night, while trying to sleep, I heard its voice clearly for the first time. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was a dominant presence that filled my mind with images of ancient battles and the faces of fallen soldiers crying out for revenge. The weapon had not only chosen me, it was using me to continue a war that had begun centuries ago. The following weeks were a whirlwind of successful operations. We became invincible, or so I thought. But with every enemy that fell, the voice grew stronger, more demanding. It started to demand more than just tactical victories. It wanted sacrifices. One night, after a particularly bloody ambush, the truth hit me with the force of a grenade. I saw their faces, the men I had killed, not just as enemies, but as lost souls dragged into the abyss by my hand. The weapon wasn't just consuming those who died by its bullets. It was also consuming me, feeding on my soul. I decided to confront the entity that resided within the rifle. One night under the moonlight, I confronted it. I screamed, I begged it to release me, but its response was a cold, cruel laugh that echoed in my head. However, I wasn't willing to give up. If that entity had found its way to me, I would find a way to expel it. My investigations led me to discover that the weapon had belonged to a soldier from a bygone era, a man who, like me, had been corrupted by its power. Only through an ancient ritual could I free myself, a ritual that required facing the spirits of those I had killed. With the help of a comrade who believed in the supernatural, I prepared the ritual. It was a moonless night, the kind of night that seems to devour all traces of light and hope. We placed the rifle in the center of a circle of ancient symbols and began to recite forgotten words, hoping it would be enough to break the curse. The spirits appeared one by one, confronting me not with violence, but with questions that cut deeper than any knife. Every answer I gave was a step toward my liberation or my condemnation. When the last spirit disappeared, the rifle disintegrated into a cloud of dark ashes, and the voice went silent forever. Years have passed since that night. I left the army and found peace in civilian life, but the shadows of those days never completely leave me. I now work with war veterans, helping others find their way back from the darkness, sharing my story as a warning about the hidden costs of power and war. Every person I talk to, every life I help rebuild offers me a bit of redemption. Although I know I can never fully atone for the lives lost by my hand, each day is an opportunity to do something good, to counteract the darkness with a bit of light. Sometimes on the loneliest nights, I can still hear an echo of that cold laugh, a sinister reminder that some battles are fought within. But now I am equipped with a different strength, a strength forged in understanding and repentance. This diary is my confession and my legacy. For those who read it, remember that in every choice we make, especially in times of war, we carry with us not only the responsibility for our actions, but also the consequences they can have on the soul. I hope my experience serves to dissuade others from taking dark paths in search of power or glory. The true courage, I have learned, lies in the ability to face our own demons and in the struggle to preserve humanity within ourselves and in others, even when all seems lost. As a soldier, I was trained to face the enemy without hesitation. As a man, I have had to learn to face myself. My greatest battle was not on the battlefield, but within me, And my greatest victory was not a medal or recognition, but the peace I finally found. This rifle, this possessed weapon, was both my greatest enemy and my hardest teacher. It taught me that in war, the most powerful weapons do not shoot bullets but wills and destinies. And ultimately, it taught me that the most important battle we can fight is the one to return home, not just in body but also in soul. It all began like any other day in the barracks. The morning was cold and gray, which seemed to foreshadow the somber atmosphere that would soon envelop our existence. "Form up!" Sergeant Martinez shouted with his authoritative voice that resonated in the cold air. We lined up, ready for another day of what we thought would be routine training. "Today will not be an ordinary day, soldiers. It will be a day you will remember for the rest of your lives." His tone was grave, but we didn't give it much importance. We thought it was just his way of motivating us. We were transported in trucks to an isolated area of the training field, an area we didn't recognize. They equipped us with what seemed to be live ammunition. "Live ammunition, Sergeant?" I asked, confused and somewhat alarmed. "It's just part of the simulation, soldier. Today we're going to try something different. Act as if it were real, because for today's purposes it is," he replied with a look that brooked no argument. The exercise began with the usual noise of simulations, but something didn't feel right. The enemies seemed too coordinated, too real. And then the unthinkable happened. I saw Jimenez, one of my best friends, fall beside me with a visible bleeding wound in his chest. Everything stopped for a moment. "Man down! Man down! This is not a simulation!" I shouted, but the chaos had already erupted. The gunfire didn't cease, and with each passing minute, the line between training and reality blurred more. Soon we realized we were being hunted, not by foreign enemies, but by a section of our own army. But why? What's going on? Were the questions that echoed among us as we sought refuge. The hours passed, each more terrifying than the last. We discovered we were part of an experiment, a deadly game designed to test how far a soldier could go under maximum stress and real threat. With a small group of survivors, we managed to ambush one of our attackers. We disarmed him and demanded answers. "It's a loyalty and endurance test. Only the strongest will survive. It's what we need for the next phase," he mumbled, before a silencing shot ended his life, fired by one of our own who still believed blindly following orders was the right thing. Night fell upon us, bringing with it the weight of our actions and decisions. We were alone, betrayed by those we trusted most. We decided we wouldn't be lab rats in their macabre experiments. Armed with what we had gathered, we planned an escape that felt more like a suicide mission. But dying on our terms was better than being killed in their sick game. The escape was brutal. We lost more comrades, each death a permanent scar in my memory. But at dawn, the few of us who remained reached an outpost controlled by regular forces, who were surprised to see us emerging from the forest, bruised and bloody. The ensuing investigation was extensive and exhaustive. High-ranking officials were prosecuted. It was discovered that the deadly simulation was part of a larger plan to develop an elite unit capable of operating under the most extreme imaginable conditions. Many of those involved claimed it was necessary to prepare us for future threats. But for us survivors, it was just a senseless massacre. Although justice began to take shape, for those of us who survived, the battle was far from over. The ghosts of those days followed us wherever we went. Some found solace in the company of other veterans, others in the silence of solitude. I decided to write to give a voice to those who no longer had one and to process my own pain and confusion. Every word I wrote was a step toward my recovery, but also a stab of remembrance of the terror we had faced. By sharing our story, I hope to expose the depths of depravity that the human mind can reach, hidden behind the facade of military discipline and preparation for war. Over time, our group of survivors became a kind of family. We supported each other, knowing that each of us shared a piece of the same dark memory. We worked to rebuild our lives, but we knew some wounds would never fully heal. Now, years later, I look back not just to remember those we lost, but to remember why it is essential to fight against such atrocities, I now teach young cadets not only about tactics and strategy, but also about the ethics and morals that must guide a soldier. It is my way of ensuring the horror we lived through never repeats itself. This book is my testament and my challenge to future generations of soldiers and military leaders. Learn from our mistakes, embrace compassion, and remember that the true purpose of any great power is to protect, not destroy. It is my hope that by sharing this story, I can light a spark in the darkness, a spark that will one day dispel the shadows of that deadly simulation that marked our lives forever. After my discharge from service, civilian life felt like foreign terrain. Days passed with painful slowness, and every night was a struggle against the shadows of the war that refused to leave me. I never imagined that Marco's face, my fallen comrade, would become my constant companion, my personal torture. It was on one of those restless nights when I saw him for the first time. He was sitting on the edge of my bed, as real as any living person. "Why didn't you do more?" he asked with a voice that resonated deep within me. His presence was impossible, but there he was, accusing me with his eyes full of reproach. Every day, Marco reappeared, in the supermarket, in the park, in the quiet of my living room. There was no escape. "You should have saved me," he whispered, following me with every step I took. His words were like knives that pierced my guilt and remorse. Desperate, I sought help. Therapists listened, nodded, and offered words meant to be comforting, but nothing dispelled Marco's figure. "You're hallucinating. It's just PTSD," they explained. They prescribed medications, advised more therapy, exercise, anything to distract my mind. But Marco never left. One night, tired of running, I decided to confront him. "Go away! Leave me alone!" I shouted at nothing, at the figure only I could see. But Marco approached, his face inches from mine. "I can't leave until you face what happened, until you face your truth." I took my old backpack and headed to the place where it all ended for Marco, the desert where we had served together. The journey was a pilgrimage, an attempt to seek answers or perhaps redemption. There in the vastness of the desert, Marco appeared once more. "It's time for you to see," he said, and the world around us began to change. Visions of battles, of decisions made in seconds, all replayed before me. I saw Marco falling, saw my hesitation, my fear. The reality of war, raw and unfiltered, unfolded before me. The visions showed me not only Marco's death, but also the times I had saved lives, the impossible decisions I had faced. War is not just death, it is also survival. It is humanity amid chaos, Marco said, his voice softer now. For the first time, I understood that his appearance was not a punishment, but a call to accept the complexity of my actions, of my decisions. Marco wanted me to find peace, not just with him, but with myself. After days in the desert, facing every demon, every shadow, I felt Marco begin to fade. "It's time for us both to find peace," he said, and with those words his figure began to dissipate like dust carried by the wind. I returned home feeling a lighter burden on my shoulders. It wasn't the end of the pain or the memory, but it was the beginning of acceptance. Marco no longer appeared, but his memory lived on, not as a ghost that haunted, but as a reminder that life, with all its pain and beauty, must be lived fully. Now, years after those dark days, I dedicate part of my time to talking with other veterans who struggle with their own ghosts. I share my story, not just as a testimony of war, but also as a hope that peace can be found. In meetings with other veterans, we openly talk about our experiences, our losses, and our steps towards healing. Marco's story has become a tool to help others understand that facing our fears and guilt is the first step to overcoming them. Therapy never really ended for me. It is a continuous process, a series of ups and downs that I handle with more grace now. I accepted that the path to recovery is often as unpredictable as the war itself, but every step forward is a triumph. Sometimes, when the night is especially quiet and the shadows of the past threaten to return, I remember Marco's voice telling me to find peace. Those words, though born from painful hallucinations, now serve as a beacon of hope. I decided to write a book about my experience, detailing not only the horrors of war, but also the journey towards post-traumatic recovery. The goal is clear, to show that even in the depths of despair, there is a light of hope. Over time, my story has gained recognition, not for the battles I fought on the field, but for the battle I won within my own mind. Both military and civilian institutions use my book as a resource to help those facing post-traumatic stress. Each day is a new dawn, an opportunity to live with the memory of Marco, not as a shadow that darkens my existence, but as a reminder of human resilience and strength. I have learned to live not only for myself, but for those who could not return home. In the quiet of the night, when the world seems to stop and I reflect on my journey, I find a peace I once thought impossible. Marco, my ghostly companion, taught me the most valuable lesson. Amid trauma and loss, there is always room for growth and redemption. His memory lives in every page I write, in every story I share, and in every sigh of relief I can now breathe freely. Thus, with each word, each encounter, and each shared memory, I move forward, forging a future where the past does not control but illuminates the path to healing. And on that path, I am finally at peace, accompanied not by ghosts but by the echoes of the lessons learned. The last thing I remember before everything went dark was the sound of gunfire and the sharp pain in my head. When I woke up, I found myself in a cold, damp cell with my hands tied and a throbbing pain reminding me I was alive, but barely. "Where am I?" was the first question I murmured, though I knew no one would answer. It didn't take long before the cell door opened. A stern-looking man in an unfamiliar uniform entered. "Good morning, soldier. I have some questions for you," he said with a heavy accent I couldn't place. They started with standard questions about my unit and mission, but quickly turned to something I didn't expect. "Tell us about Project Eclipse," the interrogator demanded with a piercing look. "Project Eclipse? I don't know what you're talking about," I replied, but the expression on his face told me he didn't believe me. I realized they weren't interested in strategies or troop movements. They wanted information about a secret military experiment I had only heard whispers about in the dark hallways of my base. Days passed, and with each interrogation session, the pressure increased. They began showing me images and documents that were supposedly part of Project Eclipse. They talked about experimental weapons and climate manipulation, topics that sounded more like science fiction than reality. But every document I saw bore my government seal. One night, as I lay in the cell trying to understand what I really knew, the door opened silently. A woman I had seen briefly during my interrogations entered. "You don't have much time. You need to understand the gravity of what you know," she whispered quickly. She worked for an organization opposed to my government's experiments. According to her, Project Eclipse was real and far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. The enemy wanted this technology not to stop it, but to use it. With the help of this woman, whose name I never knew, we planned an escape. It was risky and dangerous, but it was my only chance. One night, taking advantage of a guard change, and with my allies' complicity, I managed to get out of the cell in the base. Once safe, my mysterious savior shared more details. Project Eclipse was not only capable of altering the climate, but was originally designed to be a form of geophysical warfare, capable of devastating entire nations without deploying a single soldier. Knowing the truth put me in a moral dilemma. Should I expose my own government, potentially causing an international scandal and putting my life and my family's at risk? Or should I remain silent and hope the enemy didn't manage to replicate the technology? After many sleepless nights and long discussions with my ally, I decided I couldn't let such power fall into the wrong hands, whether they were my country's or anyone else's. I made the decision to leak the information to the international press, ensuring the world knew what was at stake. The consequences were immediate and severe. I was labeled a traitor by my government and a hero by others. But most importantly, Project Eclipse was halted, at least temporarily, while international investigations began. Public scrutiny and diplomatic pressure forced my government to dismantle the program and open its archives to international inspectors. My life changed forever. Under a new identity provided by the organization that helped me escape, I started living in a distant country, always looking over my shoulder, aware that there could still be repercussions. Tranquility had disappeared from my life, but I had gained some peace knowing I had done the right thing. Over time, I began to reflect on the weight of knowledge and the responsibility it entails. Every document I had seen and every word I had heard during my captivity resonated within me, reminding me of the power of information and how dangerous it can be. Despite the constant danger and life in exile, I found some redemption in helping others in similar situations. Working with non-governmental organizations and human rights groups, I used my experience and knowledge to prevent other experiments similar to Project Eclipse from taking place. My life had taken on a new purpose. Although I was no longer a soldier in the traditional sense, I continued fighting a different war, a war against the abuse of power and corruption. Every report I helped draft, every leak I coordinated was a step towards a safer world. Looking back, the journey from that dark cell to the present had been long and torturous. However, despite the challenges and sacrifices, I wouldn't change my actions. The world needed to know, and I had been the messenger. Sometimes the cost of truth is high, but the price of ignorance is much more devastating. Now I write these words not only as a testimony of what happened, but as a call to vigilance. Power, especially power that can alter the planet, must be rigorously controlled and supervised. My story is a reminder that even in the deepest shadows, the light of truth eventually finds its way. And as the ink flows on the paper, I know that although my role in this drama has ended, the story continues. Other people will take up the torch, and I hope they find inspiration in my story to act with courage no matter the adversity. In a world where the truth is often stranger and more terrifying than fiction, the fight for justice and integrity never ends.